So we're going to take a look at the brain, and we're going to just briefly go over the exterior portion, the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and then we'll delve into the corpus callosum and the ventricular system. So we are looking at the frontal lobes of the brain, and this is the right lobe and this is the left lobe. And you can see the brainstem beyond that. So you can see the pons and the medulla. And then you can see the internal jugular veins, the right internal jugular vein and the left internal jugular vein coming down from the brain as they drain it. And I'm going to spin this to the side now. And for the cerebrum, we're going to take a look at this is the left side of the brain, by the way. This is the anterior, superior, posterior, and inferior. And this is the frontal lobe. And this is the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe right here. And then you see the cerebellum. And now I'm going to spin this back to the front, and we are going to just slide this panel up a little bit. Yeah. There we go. All right. And so now we're going to slice the brain in half so that we can see the midline. So for your fifth drawing assignment or presentation assignment, this is what you would have used for probably the majority of your assignment, is this midline view. And this is the superior aspect, anterior, posterior, and inferior. And you can see the cerebrum here and the cerebellum here. Just inferior to the occipital lobe is the cerebellum. And if you're looking at a midline view of the brain, you are going to see corpus callosum. You will not see lateral ventricle, so please don't get that confused. You'll see the corpus callosum just inferior to the cerebrum, and inferior to that is that thin membrane, the septum pellucidum that separates the two lateral ventricles. So you won't see lateral ventricle here. You will see the septum pellucidum. And then below that, you'll see the fornix. Inferior to the fornix is the third ventricle. And you'll see draining from the lateral ventricles, you've got this little aperture here called the foramen of Monroe, and it is draining from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle. You see the third ventricle here with the interthalamic adhesion, and then draining from the third ventricle is the aqueduct of Sylvius, or cerebral aqueduct, and that drains into the fourth ventricle, which is just anterior to the cerebellum, and then that drains down into the obex here. There we go, obex, and down into the brainstem. And here we have the pons, and inferior to the pons is the medulla oblongata. So that gives you a little brief overview. We've got the pituitary gland here and the optic chiasm here. So that gives you just a little brief overview and what you will see midline when you're looking at the brain. I just don't want you to think when you see this picture, because everything has a very similar shape here. You've got the corpus callosum and the lateral ventricles, and then also the head of the caudate nucleus, the head and the body, and they all have this similar shape. And sometimes when you see it drawn, it's very confusing. So I am going to then make this just a little bit more transparent by sliding this up. And so now the brain has basically been taken away, and you can just see the middle structures. And I'm going to turn this again, and you can see how everything has that similar shape. So now we have the corpus callosum, and we're looking at the anterior side here of the corpus callosum. You can see the lateral ventricle, which sits just lateral to the corpus callosum, and then you can see the caudate nucleus, which sits lateral to the lateral ventricle, and then the lentiform nucleus is out here. I'm going to spin a little bit further so you can see how everything takes on that same kind of a C shape, not quite C shape, I guess a little oblong, but they all have that similar pattern. So when you see something drawn, you don't always know what it is, but if you see a tail out here, you're going to know that's part of the ventricular system. Normally, I will tell you to label the ventricle system, so then you know that the corpus callosum is not a part of that. But I wanted to go over a little bit the head of the caudate nucleus while we're here on the lateral side, and the body and then the tail. And I'm maybe going to pronounce this wrong, but I think it's amygdaloid body. I don't think they have that labeled, and I can't see my book at this point in time, but I think I'm saying it correctly, the amygdaloid body here. I am going to slide this again so we can just see the ventricular system a little bit better. There we go. So now everything else has kind of been grayed out and we can just see the ventricular system. And we're going to look at the anterior or frontal horn of the ventricle, lateral ventricle, and then the body of the lateral ventricle. You're going to look at the posterior or occipital horn. And then this is the temporal or inferior horn. And then connecting all three of those, or where they meet up, is the trigone area. So when you're looking at an axial image, and even on the coronal image, it looks a bit triangular. The trigone area looks triangular. And if it's an occipital horn of the lateral ventricle, it's more of a thin line. So just keep that in mind when you're taking a look at the ventricular system. And then this gives a much better view of the foramen of Monro as it comes down. And I'm just going to try to turn a little bit. There we go. So now you can see the foramen of Monro. And there would be two of those, one on each lateral ventricle, but we're only seeing one because we have shaved off half of the head over here. So there is the foramen of Monro and the third ventricle. Turn it back to the side here. The interthalamic adhesion, the aqueduct of Sylvius coming down into the fourth ventricle, and this is the lateral aperture, the foramen of Luschka, and then the median aperture, the foramen of Magendie. Remember, L comes before M, and then it would go into the obex and down into the central canal of the spine. So that gives you a better view of the lateral ventricles and how they relate to not only the corpus callosum, but also the head of the caudate nucleus, the head and the body of the caudate nucleus as it wraps around. And they all have that same kind of a C shape, oblong shape. And so you just have to be really aware of the rest of the image if I draw you something of what we're looking at. And then also when you are looking at a midline view of the brain, just be sure that you know that that's the corpus callosum. It has the same shape as the lateral ventricles, but in a midline, you will not see lateral ventricle. Just want to bring that point home. I'm just going to slide this up a little bit more. We're not going to go over this today, but there's some great images. If you're looking down at the brain here, you can really see how the lateral apertures go out to the side, and then the median aperture is more coming directly at us. Posterior, you don't really see that in this image. But using this virtual reality program helps to visualize all the anatomy and how it goes together. Let's see, we can go, I think, down from here. I'm still figuring out the nuances of this because it is so sensitive. But there we go. And then you can see so this image shows you how the ventricular system lives within and around the gray matter of the brain. So we've got the lateral ventricles anteriorly here, and that septum pellucidum, which separates them. And we have the third ventricle here in the middle, and then the thalamus sitting on either side. And then there'd be white matter tracks separating the thalamus from the lentiform nucleus here on the lateral side of the thalamus. And then you can see the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle as it comes up towards the back as well. And the corpus callosum anteriorly, and the splenium of the corpus callosum posteriorly. There's just some really interesting images and ways to look at the brain here in the virtual reality program. And I hope that at some point you will go to the library and use this so that you have a better understanding of the brain. It really made things easier for me to understand when I started to take a look at this in virtual reality.